The Wild West. Often imagined as a land of sheriffs and outlaws,
I'm John Baxter, sheriff.
Yeah, well, if you're the sheriff, you better get these men underground.
the real story of this iconic era is far more intriguing and layered than any Western classic. Beyond the duels and saloon brawls, the Old West was a place where the unexpected was the norm. From camels trekking across the desert to tales of survival that teeter on the unbelievable. And let's not forget the celebrities of the day, whose fame and fortunes were as wild as the land they roamed. Let's swing open the doors to our first surprising tale. Speaking of doors, have you ever wondered about those iconic swinging saloon doors seen in almost every Western movie? Picture this. You're walking down a dusty street in an old Western town, the kind where every step kicks up a little cloud of dust. It's a hot day, the kind that makes you wish for a cold drink and a spot in the shade. That's when you see them, those famous swinging saloon doors. Now, these doors weren't just for show or something dreamt up by Hollywood for a Western movie set. They were the real deal, part of everyday life in the Wild West. Think about it. Those saloons were hot, stuffy places, filled with folks smoking cigars and enjoying a drink or two. Those half-sized doors swinging back and forth, they were a clever way to let some fresh air in while keeping the place just private enough. And there's more to it. Imagine you're inside with a drink in your hand, listening to piano tunes. Those doors, they let the sounds of music and laughter drift out onto the street, kind of like an open invitation for anyone passing by to come in and join the fun. But here's a twist. When night fell, things got a bit wild in those towns, so those saloons had a backup plan. When they closed up for the night, out came the big, solid doors with locks strong enough to keep out trouble. Makes sense, right? In a place where the law was as flexible as a willow in the wind, you needed something a bit sturdier to stay safe. Even now, just thinking about those swinging doors takes you back to a time when life was a mix of adventure and the unknown. They weren't just pieces of wood on hinges. They were like the heartbeat of the saloon, swinging to the rhythm of a life that was all about grabbing onto whatever chance you got. So next time you see those swinging doors in a Western movie, remember they were more than just a set piece. They were a clever solution, a bit of fun, and a slice of life from a time when the Wild West was as real as it gets. We've just moseyed through those creaky saloon doors, right? Imagine them swinging shut behind us with a bit of Western flair. Now let's tip our hats and journey from the clinks of whiskey glasses to a scene that's more high noon than happy hour. We're about to rewind to a time in Springfield, Missouri, where the stakes were higher than a poker game on payday. Let me tell you about the time Wild Bill Hickok and Davis Tutt decided to settle their beef in a way that would make them legends of the Wild West. It's a tale that sounds like it's straight out of a movie, but this showdown was the real deal. We're talking Springfield, Missouri, back in 1865. Hickok, now he was a character you'd remember, a gunslinger, a gambler, a lawman, a guy with a knack for finding trouble. And Davis Tutt, he was cut from a similar cloth, a gambler with a Confederate streak. These two used to be buddies, believe it or not, but like any good Western drama, things went south over cards and, you guessed it, a girl, and the final straw, a watch. Hickok's watch, to be exact. Tutt took it over a gambling debt, and parading it around town was like waving a red flag in front of a bull. Now, here's where it gets good. Picture a hot, dusty day, the town square of Springfield, and these two standing apart, eyes locked. The air is so tense you could cut it with a knife. Folks around knew this was not going to end with a handshake. Hickok, always the cool customer, warned Tutt not to cross the square with that watch. Tutt, not one to back down, did just that. As he strutted across, both men reached for their guns. But Hickok, he was fast, lightning fast. His shot hit Tutt square in the chest. Tutt staggered, said something like, "Boys, I'm killed," and down he went. Just like that, it was over. Hickok got arrested, of course, but in a twist you might not expect, he was acquitted. Self-defense, they said. This shootout, it wasn't just a scuffle between two hot-headed gamblers. It turned into the stuff of legend, the kind of story that defined the Wild West. You know, when we talk about the Wild West, there's this one story that really gets to me every time. It's about the American bison. Back in the day, these massive creatures weren't just part of the scenery, they were the heart and soul of the Great Plains. Picture this, millions, and I mean millions, of bison roaming free as far as the eye could see. It was a sight to behold, a real testament to the wild, untamed spirit of the land. And for the Native American tribes, these bison were everything: food, clothing, shelter, you name it. They were deeply woven into the fabric of the tribe's lives, culturally and spiritually. But then, things took a turn for the worse. See, as settlers pushed westward, the bison faced two big threats. First up, commercial hunting. With the railroads coming in, hunters had an easy ride straight into bison territory. They were after the hides, mostly selling them back east for a pretty penny. The sad part? Most of the time they just left the rest of the animal to rot. The other threat, it was the U.S. government itself. They figured out that the best way to control the Native American tribes was to hit them where it hurt, their food source. So they backed this mass slaughter of bison, aiming to weaken the tribes and force them onto reservations. It was a brutal strategy, and unfortunately it worked all too well. By the 1880s, can you believe it, the bison population had crashed from millions to just a few hundred. We're talking about one of the most dramatic declines of any animal in modern history. It wasn't just an ecological disaster, it was a cultural tragedy for the Native Americans. But hey, the story gets a bit brighter. A bunch of conservationists, some of them former hunters who'd seen the error of their ways, started fighting to save these magnificent beasts. They set up preserves, got some laws passed, and bit by bit, the bison started making a comeback. Today, when you see a bison, it's not just an animal, it's a symbol of how close we came to wiping out a piece of our natural heritage and how we managed to bring it back from the brink. It's a real-life comeback story, a reminder of the resilience of nature, and a nod to the deep, often painful history of the West. So let's chat about what passed for entertainment in the Wild West. Now, if you're thinking it was all high drama and polished performances, think again. We're talking about a time when folks were more likely to be amused by a dancing bear than a Shakespearean play. Enter Buffalo Bill Cody, a name you might have heard in tales of the Old West. This fella decided to bring a slice of the frontier life to folks far and wide. He came up with this idea for a traveling show, Buffalo Bill's Wild West, he called it. It was part circus, part history lesson, all rolled into one. And who did he rope into this? None other than Wild Bill Hickok. Yeah, the same Hickok from the famous gunfight. But here's the kicker, old Hickok and the rest of them weren't exactly born to tread the boards, if you catch my drift. These were rough and tumble types, more at home on the back of a horse than on a stage. The shows they put on, well, they were a hoot, but not because they were good. Picture this, you got these tough, weathered gunslingers trying to act out scenes from the Wild West. Most couldn't remember their lines, or if they did, they mumbled them in a way that had the audience scratching their heads. And Hickok, rumor has it, he once got so fed up during a performance that he shot out a stage light. Talk about live special effects. But here's the thing, the people loved it. They came in droves, not for polished play, but for the raw, authentic taste of the Wild West. It was like watching a moving, breathing piece of history, a little rough around the edges, but all the more charming for it. So whenever you think of entertainment in the Wild West, don't picture grand theaters and Shakespearean sonnets. Think more along the lines of gritty gunslingers fumbling through their lines and audiences laughing not just at the jokes, but at the sheer absurdity and novelty of it all. It was a different time, a different world, but one thing's for sure. They knew how to have a good time in their own unique way.
This is fantastic. How'd you cook it?
Out on the Great Plains, pioneers had to be a bit inventive, especially when it came to cooking. Trees were about as common as a quiet saloon on a Friday night, which meant wood for campfires was scarce. But nature had a different kind of fuel in store, buffalo poop. Yes, you heard that right. Now, before you wrinkle your nose, let me tell you, this stuff was like gold for cooking out on the prairie. Folks called them meadow pies or prairie chips, which sounds a whole lot nicer than what they actually were, but believe it or not, when you're out there with not a tree in sight and a hungry belly, you get creative. So how did they do it? They'd scout around for the dried up stuff, the kind that had been baking in the hot sun, not the fresh, steamy piles you'd want to steer clear of. These dried buffalo droppings were the perfect fuel. They'd light up easily, burn hot and fast, and here's the kicker, they didn't smell bad. That's right, no stinky smoke to ruin your appetite. And there they'd be, cooking their bacon over a fire fueled by buffalo dung out in the open plains under a vast sky. It was a way of life, a testament to the pioneers' ability to adapt and make do with what they had. So next time you're firing up the grill or waiting for your stove to heat up, think about those frontier cooks using what nature provided to whip up a meal in the vast, treeless expanse of the Great Plains. It's a reminder of the ingenuity and resilience of those who blazed the trails of the Wild West. So, let's chat a bit more about what breakfast looked like for those tough-as-nails pioneers heading west. Trust me, it's a far cry from grabbing a quick coffee and bagel on your way to work. Imagine you're part of a wagon train, right? Your alarm clock is basically the first light of dawn around 4 a.m. And let me tell you, there's no snooze button on this kind of wake-up call. You've got a laundry list of chores before you even think about eating, breaking camp, saddling horses, rounding up cattle. It's not exactly a leisurely start to the day. Now let's talk coffee. This isn't your fancy cafe brew or anything you'd get from a machine. The women of the group, and yeah, more power to the beautiful traditional ladies, would get the fire going for some serious coffee business. They'd roast green coffee beans right there in a skillet, grind them up, and then brew the coffee over the open fire. Makes your modern-day Keurig look like a miracle, doesn't it? And what's on the menu for the most important meal of the day? Bacon, lots of it. We're not talking about thin, crispy strips, but big, hearty slabs of bacon sizzling in the skillet. This stuff was like gold for pioneers. On a good day, you might get some cornmeal gruel to go along with it, but mostly it was all about the bacon. Believe it or not, they'd chow down on bacon 2 or 3 times a day. It was the kind of food that kept you going, and if it was smoked and cured just right, it could last the whole journey, though I'd take that with a grain of salt. You've seen those Hollywood westerns, right? The ones where every cowboy's got a 6-shooter at their hip, ready to draw at the drop of a hat. Well, hold your horses, because the real Wild West wasn't quite like that. In fact, it might surprise you to hear that a lot of those old towns were pretty strict about their gun laws. Take Deadwood, Dodge City, and even Tombstone, places that movies make out to be wilder than a bucking bronco. But the truth? If you strolled into these towns with your gun, you'd be breaking the law. That's right, carrying a gun within city limits. Not on their watch. Picture this. You ride into town after a long journey, dust swirling around your boots. First stop wasn't the saloon or the hotel, it was the sheriff's office. And you weren't stopping by to say howdy. You were there to hand over your gun. Think of it like a coat check, but instead of hanging up your Stetson or duster, you're checking in your Colt or Winchester. This was their way of keeping the peace. Sure, the West was wild, but these folks weren't keen on having shootouts on their main streets. They knew a thing or two about keeping their towns from turning into free-for-alls. So when you hear tales about the Wild West, all guns and glory, just remember that those sheriffs and town marshals were laying down the law one gun check at a time. It's kind of funny when you think about it. The Old West, famous for its outlaws and gunfighters, was also a place where you had to leave your gun at the door. When you think of cowboys in the Wild West, the image that often comes to mind is probably something out of a classic Hollywood Western, but here's a twist in the tale. The real cowboys were a lot more diverse than those movies would have you believe. It turns out that about 1 in 4 cowboys were actually black. Surprised? Well, see, it's a part of history that doesn't always make it into the mainstream stories. These African-American cowboys played a huge role in shaping the cattle industry, which was the lifeblood of the West. And it wasn't just black cowboys. There were Hispanic vaqueros, who were actually some of the first cowboys in the region. Their skills with lassoing and cattle herding were second to none and deeply influenced what we think of as cowboy skills today. Native Americans, too, were part of this diverse group, along with cowboys of European descent. They all rode the same dusty trails, slept under the same star-filled skies, and faced the same dangers of the frontier, from cattle rustling to the unpredictable forces of nature. So why don't we hear about this diversity much? Well, it's like a lot of history. Sometimes the stories that get told are the ones that fit a certain narrative. But the truth is, the Wild West was a melting pot of cultures, and the cowboy life was a testament to that. The diverse backgrounds of these cowboys brought different skills, knowledge, and tradition to the job. They might have been united by their work, but each brought a unique piece of their heritage to the cowboy culture. Now here's a slice of Wild West history that might just raise an eyebrow. Camels, those humped desert-dwelling creatures, once trod the dusty trails of the American West. Sounds like a tall tale, right? But it's as true as the blue sky over a prairie. Back in the mid-1800s, someone had the bright idea to bring camels to America. The thinking was pretty straightforward. Camels are great at carrying heavy loads. They don't need much water, and they're right at home in harsh desert environments. So the U.S. Army figured they'd be perfect for trekking across the vast, uncharted territories of the West. They called it the U.S. Camel Corps. The Army brought over a bunch of these camels, thinking they'd revolutionize travel and transportation in the arid regions. And for a while, it seemed like a smart move. These camels could carry more than horses and mules, and they could go longer without water. But here's the thing about plans. They don't always pan out. Turns out camels are a bit, temperamental. They spooked easily, weren't too fond of the rough terrain, and let's just say they didn't play nice with the horses and mules. Plus, when the Civil War kicked off, the Camel Corps idea kind of fell by the wayside. So what happened to these desert ships? Some were sold off. Others escaped and went feral. For years afterward, people would report spotting camels wandering the wilds of Texas, Arizona, and other parts of the West. Imagine being a settler or a cowboy and seeing a big, hulking camel ambling across the plains. That'd sure make you rub your eyes and think you'd had a bit too much sun. We've delved into the real stories behind the swinging saloon doors, debunked myths about gunslinging cowboys, and uncovered the innovative, if a bit unusual, practices of frontier cooking. We've paid homage to the bison, once on the brink of extinction, and the surprising role of stage plays in Western entertainment. So the next time you think about the Old West, remember these stories, the truths behind the legends and the people behind the myths. It's a chapter of history that continues to captivate, inspire, and most importantly, teach us about the enduring spirit of adventure and the relentless pursuit of survival and progress.